Hey everyone, it's Matt Sikoria here. Welcome to this episode of the Behavioral Observations podcast. In today's episode, I sit down with Grant Sickle from Frontera Health, and you'll find that he has a pretty unique career trajectory. He started out at Amazon, learning the ins and outs of customer-centric product design, and now he's leading the product team at Frontera, a company that's working to improve autism care through these amazing AI-powered tools. We get into some really interesting territory in this episode. We talk about how technology like Frontera's assessment builder and diagnostic platform can help reduce waitlists and ease administrative burdens for clinicians. We also wrestle with the big questions like how to make sure AI doesn't overstep in clinical decision-making and how to keep quality and ethics at the center of care. We also talk about their home-based pilot program for parent engagement, fraud prevention measures, and what the future of ABA therapy might look like when supported by technology. So, having said all that, let's get right to the discussion. So, without any further delay, please enjoy this really interesting conversation I had with Grant Sickle.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now, here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Grant Sickle, welcome to the Behavioral Observations podcast. How are you doing today?
Doing well. Thanks for having me, Matt. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have the conversation too. This is the third installment in the special series on AI with Frontera. We've had a couple of other episodes that we've done already with the founder, Amal, and then we had the last one was really interesting with Sydney, and I'll put links to those in the show notes for folks who might not have caught those. And so now we're taking a different look under the hood at Frontera, and we're going to talk about some of the role that you have and some of the insights that you've learned along the way and working with the team over there. So let's start out by, if you could just give us a brief description of what what your role is at Frontera, and then we can get in. There's a whole list of things I want to get into, but I want the folks who are listening to have a little bit of background into, where you're coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. So I lead the product team here at Frontera, and I guess maybe taking a step back, when you think about a technology company, there's kind of traditionally three roles that all interact to kind of deliver the software that you see as an end user. And so that's typically product, engineering, and design. And then I think what's kind of unique about our company versus some of the other traditional software companies is we also have machine learning or ML and clinical teams. And really the role of a product manager, I almost liken it to, WD-40. We kind of lubricate, ensure that this group of different counterparts are working together to really deliver kind of best-in-class product. So from a product standpoint, really what I'm looking at is who are we building for, what we are building, and why. And really providing that context to the rest of the team, whether that's design engineering or ML. On a day-to-day basis, doing a lot of market and user research, really providing context for the team. While, product is responsible for the who, what, and why, that isn't built in isolation. It's a full team effort. So the more context that I can give engineering, design, and ML and the clinical team around the why and who and what, then we just get at a much better solution. And then, of course, defining the products, what we're going to build, and then very tactically speaking, kind of prioritization on a week-to-week basis.
I see. So you come to ABA from a different path, from a more product management standpoint, and you've had some interesting, career experiences at some companies that we're all familiar with and things like that, like Amazon and perhaps some other places. So can you give the listeners a little bit of insight into, go into a little bit more detail about what a product manager does do, especially, and maybe related to some of those more well-known companies. So in other words, if people aren't necessarily familiar with Amazon, with Frontera, but they're certainly familiar with Amazon, that might give people some more context to really develop an understanding of what someone in your role does.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I'll start way back at my early days at Amazon, really fresh out of college. So, I joined Amazon for a couple of reasons. I think one, first and foremost, was just the opportunity to learn from the best. They were a fast growing company, had a pretty revolutionary idea, moving from, your Barnes and Noble's brick and mortar bookstore to providing immense selection over time. So, that was really attractive for someone coming right out of college, is just the caliber of folks that they had on the team and being able to learn from them. And then I think the other thing that really attracted me to Amazon, and that, I pull forward into my work now, is just the unbelievable kind of level of customer centricity that they have ingrained in their culture. There's kind of famous Jeff B question mark emails where you have CEO of this massive company sending a question mark around, a single customer email that was sent to his address. And so that kind of customer centricity really pervades the company. And I try to kind of bring that into the role that we have here at Frontera. But where I stuck was actually not.
Hang on. Could you delve in? I'm not familiar with the question mark. Can you
Yeah.
describe, is that might be some business lore that I'm not familiar with. If you could.
Yeah. So absolutely. So basically, Jeff Bezos makes his email address known to publicly. So, and he screens it. And so random customers will write in and, whether they're experiencing issues or what have you. And so he kind of takes it on himself and his staff, comb through those emails, find ones that seem like there's something to kind of pull at the threads on, and he'll go ahead and send that to the team. And that basically creates a cascading effort throughout the organization to come back with really a well-defined like COE, or correction of error. Like, how do we make it right by the customer, and how are we going to prevent this moving forward? So that's deeply ingrained in the culture, and one of the things I really, respect about that organization.
So in other words, it lights a fire under people's rear
That's right.
ends
Yeah.
to solve a problem.
Yeah. Question mark undersells the fallout from it, but it's a good practice.
Okay. All right. That's fascinating. I've never heard of that. So, but I could see getting an email from the head honcho in such a large entity like that would be motivating for a variety of reasons. So, yeah. So so how did you come in contact with the ABA sector? It seems like you're having a perfectly successful career and, with one of the largest companies in the world. And, I know you've done other things besides Amazon and stuff like that. Now, how did you come in contact with the world of applied behavior analysis, or at least the tech supports that go along with it?
Yeah. So it was somewhat opportunistic at first. So I'd been at Amazon for, I want to say, around 8 years or so. And really, I was ready for the next step of my career. I felt like I had learned a lot of the best practices, but I'd really only experienced kind of the work culture within that organization. And so I was really looking for a place where I could have more impact. I think at a large organization like Amazon, you encounter a lot more internal politics, and you're as a product manager, you're just not shipping as much product as you want, because there's a lot more kind of red tape and vying for resources across teams. And so I was really looking for a more impactful job. And the second piece of it is one that was more personally rewarding, right? I think for all the, Amazon has kind of a mixed reputation. They certainly have kind of changed the accessibility to a lot of common goods. And I think, there's good in that, but there's also, some kind of bad connotation with the name as well. And so I was really looking for a company that was more kind of mission aligned and personally more rewarding, something I could feel really proud about saying that I worked at. And so how I came into ABA was one of my former managers at Amazon, who had moved on for a while, had just joined as president of another ABA kind of startup. And so he was they had started as more or less a services organization, and we're looking to transition more into tech enabled services. So building out some of that software to give them efficiency. And so they were just starting to stand up a product team. And so got in contact with him. It seemed like a really interesting opportunity to kind of build from the ground up, and jumped at that. I in college, I did a bit of volunteering. In summers, I would work at what's called like the Cambridge Youth Enrichment Program, and taught children kind of literacy and math. So I always had a bit of a passion for the space of helping kind of cultivate the younger minds. I think in terms of setting folks up for the future, I was very fortunate to have a lot of opportunities as a young person. And so really liked the idea of being able to enter a space where you could really impact lives in a very similar way and give them those opportunities. So yeah, jumped at that opportunity and was there for a couple of years before moving on to Frontera.
I see. And let's get into what, and I know you went, kind of quickly through what your role is at Frontera and perhaps, being humble in the process of it. But I want you to kind of elaborate a little bit more in terms of, and you know what, actually, let's take it a step back here. So in case folks might have missed the first two episodes, let's take a giant step back and tell us a little bit about what Frontera actually does and some of the platforms that they've developed and how that relates to the, supporting individuals with autism.
Yeah, absolutely. So Frontera, our mission is really around increasing access to quality services, really for anyone who needs it. You know, our company is very mission focused. Our founder Amal, who you had on the podcast, he has a child with autism and has been probably one of the most active kind of investors in the autism space for well over a decade. Our head of machine learning, Manu Kohli, he has his PhD, literally wrote his thesis on computer vision and autism. He also has an adult autistic child. So it's a very mission driven company. And again, we want to bring access to quality care. And I'll go a little bit deeper on the quality part. Autism is a spectrum. I think everybody listening to this podcast knows that. But there's not a ton of precision when we think about it. There's conditions out there that there's a genetic marker for them, right? And you can go and get medication. Autism, that just doesn't exist. And because of the kind of unique nature of each child that's going into care, it's even harder to get a grasp of, is a child developing well, or could they be developing better, right? You can certainly see the trends over time in some of those assessments, but it's difficult to say, is that worse or better progress than they should be having? And so Frontera's, vision is that we can bring, a level of detail and precision to the field. Can we identify kind of phenotypes or subpopulations of autism, understand what types of care work best for those populations, and then help clinicians make better choices around how to implement that care to see ultimately better progress?
I see. And what are the, kind of specific, can you talk about the, like the specific platforms, like the assessment builder, I think is one of the ones that we've talked about most frequently.
Yeah.
So if you can maybe focus on that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we have two main product verticals, I would say. So one is what I'll call like on the report building side. So where we focused first was around the initial assessment. And so that's obviously most people on the call know that's a key bottleneck for getting into care. And it's a relatively complex payer document. So at Frontera, we actually have our own clinics in rural areas. We have clinics in Las Cruces as well as some rural parts of Colorado. And so this was also a pain point for us internally. So what our initial assessment builder does is it basically collates all the different sources of information that you would look at for an initial assessment. So interviews that you would have with like the parent, perhaps the child, all the outputs of the different assessments that you would run, whether that's, ESDM, Vineland, VB-MAP, and then any clinical notes or additional kind of documents that would help add color. And we're able to completely synthesize an initial assessment report for the clinician. So giving them back that time and to either focus on other activities like supervision, which tend to be a little bit more value add, or just go deeper in understanding the child up front. A lot of folks are kind of rushed through that initial assessment process because they're trying to get the child into care. And what winds up happening is like those treatment plans are almost completely flipped a couple weeks into care once they get to learn the child a bit better. And so you can spend more time with this tool doing that. The other kind of products we have on that side, and so one, we just launched reassessment through our integration with an EHR called Passage. So now clinicians, as that 6-month mark for most insurers comes up and they have to write a reassessment, will auto-generate that, including, all the progress charts as well as summaries of progress. And of course, the clinician is the final decision maker. They ultimately decide what gets input, but we're seeing pretty tremendous time savings. And I should mention for both of those reports, we also have done a number of customizations and have the ability to customize. So clinics, they've kind of gone through the trial and error process of figuring out what their unique mix of payers like to see in those reports. And so we found it very important to enable kind of customization. So not only can we kind of synthesize the report, but also do it in a way that very much aligns with kind of how you're doing it today in terms of report structure and payer requirements. And then we also decided to go upstream. So in New Mexico, where we have our services, it's about a 2 to 3 year wait list to get diagnosed, which is pretty depressing when you think about it,
Yeah, it's
quite
terrible.
honestly.
Yeah.
And, that's just a factor of like the number of psychologists licensed to really operate in that state. And so we wanted to figure out a way to make this process more efficient. So very similar to our initial assessment product, we also have a diagnostic product where, again, we synthesize across interviews. We support over 30 different psychological assessments, ranging from cognitive to adaptive behavior scales. And we generate that whole initial diagnostic report for the psychologist. We aren't making the diagnosis, that's still in their hands, but a lot of just that legwork of summarizing the clinical records, doing the write-ups of the different scores, we facilitate that. And so we're seeing, and we've also stood up our own services line for diagnostics. We're focused on New Mexico again to help solve for that bottleneck, but they're leveraging our tool and we're seeing them be able to turn around a report in as little as an hour now. And that used to be a 6+ hour exercise. So really meaningful time savings, again, all towards getting folks into care much more quickly.
I'm going to ask you a question I asked both Amal and Sydney, and I'll probably ask it to anyone involved in the AI space when it intersects with any type of clinical service. So on the one hand, distilling a 6-hour process to an hour sounds awesome, especially in the context of limited resources.
Sure.
However you want to define those resources. And then at the same time, there's a lot of folks who that worries them, and there are people who have, some understandable skepticism. What would you say to someone who is in the latter camp? It's like, whoa, yeah, you're saying the clinician has the final say, but you're compressing all this information and synthesizing it, and what gets left on the cutting room floor, I mean, so are you giving the clinician a condensed product or a smaller bit of, band of information, and could that lead to clinical problems and things like that? I'm not giving it. All that to say is that, can you address the what might be considered natural or healthy skepticism for someone looking at not just Frontera, but, all these AI things that are coming to market right now in the autism treatment sector?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a great question and something that we see on a regular routine basis, right? So I think the way I look at it is part of this is you need to make sure when you're evaluating AI solutions, you're looking for a couple things. And I think these things will help kind of give you confidence. And so one is really specialization. Look for companies who are going deep in your purview. Frontera obviously is doing that. When you talk about how do we have confidence in some of the results the AI is generating, is we have a very robust, I'll call it like clinical program management that is comprised of BCBAs and psychologists who are working hand in hand with myself, the engineering team, the ML team, to validate and ensure that what our models are producing is of a high clinical quality bar. So that's kind of one way that we specialize. Like there's a ton of companies out there. You've probably heard of like these different AI scribes that exist. They're going, Nabla, others, they're going with kind of a shallow but broad approach. So they're trying to hit every single industry in the medical profession, whether it's like acute care, like oncology, psychology, and they're just generating these very simple notes. I don't know if I would trust that, right? Or what you're going to get out of it may just not be entirely useful because they just haven't taken the time to go deep. So again, I would say look for a company that specializes it and has clinicians on staff informing and really helping build out the product. And I think kind of at Frontera, we have that. I think the second part, which honestly isn't that novel for the AI space, is just ensuring that you have really high quality feedback loops to the customers. So before we release anything, we do pretty rigorous internal testing, both from a technical standpoint, but then also a clinical standpoint. And then we typically do a phased rollout where we'll work not only with our internal clinics that we have in New Mexico, in Colorado, but then we'll work with some close partners and get their feedback and incorporate that into the product. So by the time that you see like a public release, we really feel like the product is hardened and we've started to see and take into account a lot of feedback that clinicians have. And so I think that feedback loop is really important. And then I guess the last one that I would probably touch on is, you know, there's a difference out there, I would say, between an AI native company like Frontera that is investing in that. Our team structure represents that, right? Like we have an ML team and we have a clinical team. And then those more like legacy software companies that are more or less trying to check a box in terms of, yes, we have AI features. I think it's really important when you're making that decision to understand that it's going to be really difficult for those legacy companies to be able to deliver a quality product for a number of reasons, whether that's the technical architecture, or as I mentioned, they simply just haven't built out the muscle or team for that. And so, I would encourage folks as they think about, what platforms to look at, look at the AI centric ones, but then also look at the SaaS software companies who I would consider ethical in that they realize that that might not be their expertise, the AI, and so they're looking to find partners for that, right? And they're open to integrations. And I think that level of customer centricity, knowing that you're not going to be able to necessarily deliver the best in class customer experience, but a partner could, and then offering that to your customers, that's a great partner to go with as well.
I see. Interesting. Yeah, I appreciate you taking a moment to address that. So, what I know in preparing for this interview, there are a couple of things you wanted to hit on. One of them is you want to talk about generalized outcome measurement. So, what outcomes are measured with with these platforms, and how what benefit does that provide whether it's the end user as a clinician and certainly ultimately the person receiving services?
Yeah, no, great question. And it touches on the product that we didn't quite get to yet. So I mentioned our report builder products. The other vertical that we have is really around digital phenotyping. And so what we've built is a HIPAA-compliant app that either a clinician, like an RBT, or a parent can download, record a video. Again, it's all encrypted. And then that gets basically processed by our models. And then a BCBA on the other side as a dashboard where they can review those videos. And so we think of it today as enabling a couple different use cases. So one is asynchronous supervision. Supervision rates in the industry, I think it's typically a 5% minimum, but some companies get up to 15%. That's still not a lot of oversight for some of the paraprofessionals in the field, particularly the newer ones. And so we view our platform as a way to enhance the quality of a clinic through that asynchronous supervision. And to get to your point on like what outcome measures we're providing. So there's a couple different angles that we're taking with this. So one is that we are trying to surface particular behaviors of interest. So where we've started is with the challenging behaviors. So we have a model that it identifies crying and screaming in a session, the duration of that, the frequency of that. We're kind of moving on to some of the others, such as tantruming, hitting, self-injurious behavior. And then we also provide a pretty robust clinical summary. And one of the things that we have coming down the pipe is the ability to actually identify the client-specific targets in a session and show that BCBA exactly where those occurred. So allowing them to go and kind of audit that. But on the outcome measurement piece, we're within the next month or so, we're going to be releasing kind of the first of these, which is really focused on expressive language. So we'll be able to track unique word count of a child over time. And of course, what class those words fall into, right? Nouns, verbs, adjectives. And then we're also going to be able to track mean length of utterance, or MLU, which is maybe an outcome that is a little bit more familiar for the speech segment, but again, speaks to like the verbal complexity in development that children are showing. So that's kind of the start of those generalized outcome measures. And my hope, and I think our hope as a company, is that those become a bit more broadly adopted across the industry. I think a lot of the targets that exist today, for instance, you may have a very specific targets around like manding for certain items. Those exist in ABA because humans can take data against those, right? Like you can prompt it, see how they respond to the prompt. But what they're getting at to a certain extent is that child's expressive language growing? And measures like unique word count, those are very, very hard for someone to like accurately take. How many unique words is this child saying over time? Right? That would be very hard to record in person. But it in some ways, it's a more direct measure of that expressive language. And so I think there's a number of these different measures that, if anything, can help augment the view that we have of the child's development over time. And, maybe in some future actually replace the need for maybe some more of that granular data collection. You'd absolutely have to have targets and treatment plans to administer, but can we remove the RBT from that burden, quite honestly, of having to take that very granular data?
Does it filter out like repetitive utterances and things like that? Because I have to imagine if someone has some vocal stereotypy, you could run up the word count to the cows come home, and then someone could look at the data with absent of context and be like, holy cow, this kid is you know doing great, when in fact they're scripting and they're reciting the lines to their favorite Disney movie and things like that.
Yeah, so we do have some deduplication logic built in there, and we have speech pathologists that are helping us with that logic as well. So we do account for some of that, absolutely, in that measure.
I see. Wow, fantastic. That's you know Amal used the word science fiction a number of times when I interviewed him, and that this does sound pretty sci-fi. That very challenging work of I mean, I don't do that type of intervention anymore, but I did years and years ago, and the tally marking and and this is like paper and pencil days, and so to free up those resources, to your point, to spend more time engaging in quality, productive interactions is, I could see how that would be incredibly beneficial. Another thing you put on your discussion list is, kind of quality control, auditing, and you mentioned the term fraud prevention. So,
Yeah.
I don't do insurance funded work, and like I said just a second ago, I don't do this type of treatment anymore. It's been quite a bit. So if you could talk about the problem of that first, and then maybe talk about how the platform might help with minimizing that.
Yeah. So fraud's a pretty big issue within ABA. I think just recently there was the article on a clinic in Michigan who was actually paying parents to say they signed up and then completely falsifying sessions. So worst case scenario, you actually have like true criminal organizations like that operating. And then I think, best case scenario, it's honestly just a lack of process hygiene that these are coming, that issues of fraud come up. But, the rising cost of ABA treatment for payers is raising it on their radar, so to speak. And they're starting to dig in on these, and every year there's tens of millions in clawbacks from fraud. And so our platform and the ability to record a session, you can't really commit fraud in that instance, right?
Mm.
If you're recording a session, there's videographic evidence that occurred. And one of the things that we're getting excited about is we also can do things like even facial recognition to make sure that that is the RBT and that's not just some random individual that is operating in the session as well. So we could even go like that far. But the bottom line is that besides a SOAP note with a signature, there's not a lot of checks and balances in place to ensure that a session actually occurred. And so, and even for large organizations, right? How do you think about maintaining quality across, 20 different states and hundreds of different clinics, right? Like, how do you know that a particular branch or clinic is operating ethically. And so our tool provides a great way for the clinical directors and at a more granular level, the BCBAs, to understand how sessions are actually going, that they actually occurred, that it's quality therapy being delivered. So we're really excited about that use case. I think, where we'd like to take it, and, there's a little bit of a pie in the sky shot, but could we get auto reimbursement from insurers if you are able to provide video, in immediate reimbursement for insurers if you're able to provide videographic evidence, right? Insurers spend a ton of time auditing the different claims of providers, and there's quite a bit of delay that really impacts the cash flow of a clinic. So can we, get to a place where that's almost immediate based on the videographic evidence we provide?
Well, that is, you've got the attention of various clinic owners with that item on the wish list there for sure. But I guess conceptually it would make sense, but we'll see. So that's pretty cool. So yeah, I appreciate you walking. That's kind of like the some of the underbelly, I guess. I know of some of the where ABA is as a I guess it's funny. It's for me, I've been doing this long before insurance reform and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just remarkable to see it as a full-fledged healthcare industry, a standalone healthcare industry. And in many respects, we're getting the good and the bad that comes along with being a standalone healthcare industry.
That's
And
right.
so fraud is, I guess, happens in other healthcare sectors as well. So I guess when you have that much money floating around, to your point, whether it's either by omission or commission, it's an issue that needs some scrutiny for sure. Yeah, and I know you want to talk about parent engagement with platform. What are there specific case examples that come to mind, or stories that you have in mind that in which this tool has been helpful in creating more engagement with parents?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple from our own clinic. So as I mentioned, we have this app that parents or RBTs can download. And so we rolled it out as a pilot within our clinic. And I think some of the results are what you'd expect. Some parents don't engage at all. But then there's a set of the population that is very engaged. And they're sending examples of behaviors that are only occurring at home, or situations that like only occur at home that their child struggles with. Feeding is a good example, right? Or even just tantruming. And so parents are able to send in these clips, and then our BCBAs are providing feedback. Feedback like, try using a preferred item to kind of help them transition these activities, right? Or for this feeding, like slowly incorporate, the new foods. And so they're providing a lot of tactical guidance for these behaviors that parents are struggling with. So they're kind of tying the progress of the child much more directly back, to the parent. And then there's this general challenge in ABA around like generalization of what's learned in therapy, right? And understanding is sure, a child can do XYZ activity in the clinic setting, but are they translating that to in-home and in public? And this is now a platform that parents can capture that and either confirm that or say, hey, no, we're really still struggling with this, and provides BCBAs the context that they need to be able to better address that. Because right now they're just relying on anecdotes, even in a session, right? They have their charts of data, but to really understand what's going on, they're going to the RBT, which for better or worse could be like an impartial view, a biased view, or just maybe they don't know what exactly the BCBA is looking for, right? Or, for challenging behaviors, it's often hard to recall like the antecedent, right? Like it just happened in their mind. And so it's things like that this video context is extremely helpful for, and more so even on the parent side. So we're seeing a lot of parent engagement with a good subset of that pilot, and we're very excited to roll it out with some partner clinics and more broadly internally as well.
I see. This is fascinating stuff. I got a few more questions for you, Grant, before I let you go.
Yeah.
What is the learning curve, from, if you're a parent, I have to imagine that the gung ho go getter parent
Mhm.
is going to tackle learning how to use the app, regardless of no matter how steep or
Yeah.
shallow the learning curve happens to be. But as it relates to whether it's parents, technicians, or behavior analysts, what how quickly does it take to kind of get up to speed with using it?
Yeah. So I guess I'll split it up. The users up between those who are like recording, like the parents, RBTs, and then those who are more on like the review side, the BCBA. So on the RBT and parent side, we've really tried to keep the app as simple as possible. It looks very similar to your camera app on your iPhone or Android device. You simply open it up and record. You don't have to hit upload. It automatically uploads. So we've really tried to keep that simple. And then of course with any of our partners we do a brief training, but we haven't gotten a ton of feedback like negatively about the usability. Most of the parents can pretty intuitively pick it up given kind of the smartphone age that we're in. I think where we see a little bit of a problem transparently is just around like internet quality and making sure that those uploads happen. And so we've done a lot of work on our side to streamline that process. And, I think we're in a place where we're seeing really high rate of upload success, even in very spotty, areas of Wi-Fi and with low Wi-Fi. On the BCBA side, it is a process change, right? Like they're not hopping in and doing, in a lot of cases, asynchronous supervision today. And so this is a change management process, but our BCBAs in our clinic and our partner clinics, it hasn't taken long. It's more so like the lift of getting it set up, allocating the right amount of time, and then they're almost finding like new use cases for the platform on their own. And I'll give you an example. In our clinic, our clinical trainer is now using it quite extensively to show good examples of different kind of treatment programs being run to new RBTs. And then, rather than an RBT basically going through their 40-hour course, getting their certification, maybe doing a bit of shadowing, and then more or less getting, thrown into the therapy environment, we're able to supervise 100% of those sessions for an extended period and provide very detailed support and feedback for those RBTs who are coming on. And we've seen a pretty marked decrease in our RBT attrition as a result of that. And so just to kind of circle back to your point, I think from a recording standpoint, pretty intuitive on the BCBA side. There's changes to the workflow, but once they pick them up, we're seeing a lot of kind of ingenuity around the different use cases in which this can be applied. And it's less around the technological complexity. We really try to make the interface as simple as possible. It's more so like, how does this fit into my day? And that's kind of a partnership that we kind of discover with the client on how to best implement in their clinic, given their fee structure, what they're looking to achieve. Our customer implementation team does a great job of partnering with clinics to understand how to best fit that into their workflows.
All right. I want to give you the opportunity to highlight anything else you think is noteworthy that we haven't had a chance to discuss thus far. And then if we've, kind of, if we've talked about some of all the things that you want to discuss thus far, I also want to end with this question here. You're using a lot of, ABA vernacular, and I'm just curious, anyone who comes to ABA from kind of like what we might consider a non-traditional route,
Sure.
and in your case, doing something that's, kind of, clinical adjacent, I suppose. What have you learned about ABA? Is there anything that you know that struck you about, because obviously I'm imagining that, when you came into this sector, you had to get up to speed with like,
Yeah.
how behavior works and, what we do and how we see the world and things like that. Are there any similarities or any lessons or anything like that you took from, kind of learning about, I guess, our profession, our culture, and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, a couple. So I think one of the biggest things is like the focus on data, which like honestly really resonated with me from like a product management perspective. The amount that the profession leverages data to make informed decisions, I think is amazing. And so that stayed with me. And now it's kind of, how do we make sure that that's extremely high fidelity data, and that we pair that data with some of the other contexts that may not be able to be captured through that. Just to go back to like Amazon, there's actually another famous Jeff Bezos quote that was, where the data and anecdotes conflict, believe the anecdote. And so, that's an interesting way. And basically what he's getting at is that there's certain things from like a customer experience perspective or a client development perspective that the data is just not always going to be able to capture. And so our kind of platform helps really give that anecdotal data or contextual data through the video to allow you to make just better decisions and kind of do right by the client. So I would say the data is one piece. And then the other thing that struck me is just the sheer variety of what's kind of under the umbrella of ABA therapy. The number of different models are out there. And I think, from a product management standpoint, that has both challenges and opportunities. It's challenging in that you have to really make sure that your features perform well and make sense in the case of like naturalistic therapy, as well as like, more trial-based therapy. But it also opens up a lot of opportunities to kind of facilitate therapies in different ways. And so, passive data collection for the direct trial may be really helpful. And then some of the naturalistic, we can develop certain metrics, like how much is play-based? Are you following the lead of the child? How many prompts are there? And so there's kind of nuances, obviously, within this ABA umbrella that I think are super interesting. And when we think about like the longer term vision of the platform, what we'd ultimately love to get to at Frontera is a place where, again, we can kind of identify the subpopulations of autism and then figure out which of those different therapy methods work best for that subpopulation or that phenotype of a child. And so again, I think there's some complexity that brings, but then there's a lot of opportunity on the product side.
All right. Well, I appreciate you drawing those comparisons and sharing those observations. It's like I said, it's always interesting when people arrive to behavior analysis from different fields. And over the years, I've gotten to know some folks who have backgrounds in the the STEM, various types of STEM fields, particularly engineering. When they encounter behavior analysis, they have an admiration for it for similar reasons, for sure. So, all right. Well, Grant, where can people learn more about Frontera's products and services?
Yeah, you can check us out at fronterahealth.com. We're also active on all social medias, more or less. We have TikTok, LinkedIn. You'll probably see our founder Amal out there, but
he's a machine on LinkedIn.
He does a good job with that. And so please feel free to reach out. Yeah, would love to talk with you all and learn more about your use case.
All right. I'll make sure your LinkedIn profiles are in the show notes for this episode, along with the links to the site itself for people who want to learn more. All right, Grant, thanks so much for joining me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Really appreciate it, Matt. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.